mostly female press corps covering the first woman ever to hold statewide office in New York. The campaign travelogue recounts the story of First Lady Hillary Clinton's 62-county campaign to become a U.S. Senator from New York, takes us backstage into the exhausted press bus, and recreates the frustrations of covering a Senate candidate who has the added protection of a Secret Service detail. Join Beth Harpaz and the Girls in the Van today at 1:40 p.m. Eastern.
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Join us for a look at the world of nonfiction books and the publishing industry, Saturday morning at 8 through Monday morning at 8 Eastern. 48 hours of nonfiction books all weekend, every weekend on Book TV. American interventionism abroad, one of today's major political issues, was also on the front burner during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Next, historian Edmund Morris explores that period's differences and similarities with today, along with a series of major issues faced by the youngest president in American history. The title of his new book is Theodore Rex, the sequel to his 1979 Pulitzer Prize-winning first volume, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. He details his view that Roosevelt, riding a wave of industrialization, was the next great president to succeed Lincoln. It's 55 minutes.
Okay, we're ready to start. For those of you who are new to the store, I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the owners here. My partner is Carla Cohen, who is around here someplace. And this evening, we're welcoming Edmund Morris, the author of Theodore Rex, to talk about his book. I was just talking to Edmund Morris as we were walking in about the track record of his appearances at Politics and Prose. We have different memories, but we do both remember that this is the third time that he has been to Politics and Prose. And actually, the first time is when we were still a very little store across the street. He came and talked about his book, The Art of Biography. With each book of Edmund Morris's, it seems to get better and better. His new book was described by Michael Lind in the Washington Post Review as that a great historian has met a great biographer. As most of you know, his first book, the first volume of his work on Theodore Roosevelt, was awarded the National Book Award and a Pulitzer Prize. And we have high hopes for this new volume also, and certainly that we're looking forward to a third volume, which I hope is in the works already. Edmund Morris has to pause from his writing for a little bit to go on a book tour. That's what you have to do when you're an author. You have to go around from city to city, jump on planes, go on talk shows, appear at bookstores, and talk about your book. We're lucky that Edmund Morris lives in Washington, so it's not so difficult to get him. Anyway, I wanted to introduce Edmund Morris. It's a pleasure to have him here this evening to talk about just a wonderfully colorful book about a very, very colorful president. Thank you, Edmund Morris.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Barbara, for quoting that Washington Post review. Cost me $5,000 and was worth every penny. I hope you're all admiring my magnificent Miami tan. It's actually 2 layers of Fox News Network makeup. 2 years ago, at the height of L'Affaire Dutch, I remember being on, I think, 5 national TV shows in one day, beginning with the Today Show early in the morning and ending with Charlie Rose at night. A layer of makeup for each show, and by the end of the day, I looked like Joan Crawford. First time I ever learned the true meaning of the phrase, to crack a smile. Well, we're here almost exactly a century after Theodore Roosevelt became president. On September 14th, 1901, the youngest president we've ever had, 42 years old. Vice President of the United States when an assassin's bullet smacked into McKinley's stomach. And the effect of this assassination, which was the third presidential assassination in less than 40 years, was so traumatic upon the American people that we, which is to say the American people, went into a state of shock in its time exactly similar to the state of shock we've been experiencing the last few months. It was directly related to terrorism. The person who shot McKinley had an unpronounceable name. I've been trying for 21 years to learn how to pronounce it. It's got so many C's and Z's. It looks like a Czech telephone directory. Szkolgosz, Leon Szkolgosz, represented a foreign strain of anarchism. Foreign in the sense that it was largely inculcated in Europe and had managed to spread itself across the Atlantic by means of our immigration policies. And in the early years of the century, Americans were afraid of anarchist cells and socialist cells and communist cells spreading across the country, communicating with their own rag sheets, operating in secret, all of them with the professed agenda of bringing down our free institutions. That when Theodore Roosevelt became president, he had first and foremost, as his very first item of executive agenda, to address this fear and make the American people understand, as President Bush has managed to do, that we are an indestructible country. Our institutions are vulnerable to attack, but are incapable of bringing down. And that what is most required of a president in a time like this is the ability to project through his personal behavior and through the simplicity of his language all the moral certainties that we revere in the Constitution, to reassure the people, to give an image of courage and contempt for anarchistic doctrines. And it was a technique that operated as well then, a century ago, as it has operated now. His very first public utterance was his message to Congress in December of 1901. In those days, the message to Congress, the annual message to Congress, was the equivalent of our State of the Union now. It was a document that the President sent to Congress at the beginning of December 1901, and the very first subject he addressed in this was the phenomenon of anarchism. If I can find my way past the end of this interminable prologue, I'll find a message from the President. Here we are. And this rhetoric I describe here as a magnificent 6-minute tirade against anarchism and those who abused the First Amendment by inciting it. The reading clerk, in those days the President's message was read to Congress. The reading clerk could not help but perform histrionically. Quote, "The wind is sowed by the men who preach such doctrines, and they cannot escape their responsibility for the whirlwind that is reaped. If ever anarchy is triumphant, its triumph will last but for one red moment, to be succeeded for ages by the gloomy night of despotism." This message made clear pronto not only that he was going to be an active and courageous and strong president, but also that he was a wordsmith of the first order, a man of letters whose image was original, one red night of despotism, and whose gift for language was going to make him prevail throughout the coming years, which no doubt, nobody doubted would be long. The only person in the United States who doubted that Theodore Roosevelt was going to win another term in 1904 was TR himself. He needed to persuade himself that his first term as an accidental president, as the inheritor of the of the unexpired term of President McKinley. He needed to persuade himself that it was going to be difficult to win election, if only for the joy of fighting in 1904 and winning what turned out to be the biggest landslide in American history up to that point. His resolve, his vitality, his vigor de vita, to use one of his famous favorite phrases, was first and foremost a physical endowment. He had the gift of imparting, even to a crowd who could only see him at a distance, an explosive quality, an explosive energy and good health and physical fortitude that was such that people luxuriated in his presence. It was the effect of a perfectly functioning physical mechanism, a person who had built up his body from childhood by dint of strong and ceaseless physical exercise, conquered his juvenile disabilities, which were so acute when he was 3 years old. When he was less than 3, the doctors predicted he wouldn't last much beyond his 3rd birthday. He was still, when he graduated from Harvard, a weedy, sickly youth with a bad heart and cholera morbus, a nervous disease of the intestines, and acute asthma. He was in such bad shape that the doctor at Harvard warned him that he was going to have to lead a sedentary life of mild scholarship, otherwise he would die young. And he said to the doctor, flashing his famous incisors, "Doctor, I'm going to do everything you've told me not to do. I'm going to climb mountains, I'm going to hunt animals, I'm going to live life to the full, to the hilt, until I'm 60, and then I'm going to die." And sure enough, he lived life to the hilt until he was 60, and he died. But over and above, and consonant with this marvelous physical mechanism, came a truly first-class intellect. This was a man who, by the time he became president, had already written 15 books, books of history, biography, natural history, political commentary, naval ballistics, and went on in the short space of his 60 years to write 41 books. The collected works of Theodore Roosevelt, which I have on my shelf, filled 2.5 enormous shelves. 150,000 letters, some of which he dictated 2 or 3 at a time simultaneously to 2 or 3 different stenographers. Countless magazine and periodical articles, literally countless. Nobody's ever been able to tabulate how many thousands there are. A man who read effortlessly in English, French, Italian, and German. In 1905, in the spring of 1905, during an attack of Cuban fever, as he called it, on a hunting vacation in the Rockies, while he was meditating a way of bringing about the end of the Russo-Japanese War, he read from cover to cover all 7 volumes of Lagorce's History of Medieval France in French, and gave them back to the French ambassador so massaged, so manhandled, that the covers of one volume were literally dangling off on the end of a thread. He seemed to devour the magazines that he read in such fashion that he physically tore out each page as he read it, reducing every magazine to a litter of pulp around him, as though he had consumed it physically and gobbled it whole. Owen Wister, his novelist friend, the author of The Virginian, spent a night in the Oval Office, in the White House, and gave the president a book that he recommended over dinner. TR thanked him for it, and after dinner, at about 9:30, he went upstairs, came down at 8:30 the following morning, and proceeded to recite large chunks of this book by memory to a stupefied Owen Wister over breakfast. And Wister said somehow, between his dinner and his sleep and his breakfast, he'd managed to read a volume of some 350 pages photographed whole sections of it entire, and missed nothing of significance that it contained. Now, in the presidential sphere, an intellect of this quality meant that he brought to the office an encyclopedic understanding of other civilizations. He knew all about the history of the Ottoman Empire. He understood the entire 1,000-year history of Russia. He understood the civilization of the Japanese. He understood the sensibilities of Muslims and those even more sensitive ethnics, the French. His knowledge of German mythology, his ability to recite long chunks of the Nibelungenlied by heart, enabled him to deal with Kaiser Wilhelm II, the most dangerous personality in the world in the early 20th century, with a tact and a psychological understanding that made his diplomacy truly something to be admired. One of the stories I tell in my book is a story which merits the cliché untold story, because what happened in the late months of 1902 was a crisis that led to the point of war between the United States and Germany that nobody in the universe, with the exception of a few close confidants, understood what was happening. The situation was roughly this. TR heard in October of 1902 that Germany, a burgeoning power with an insatiable desire for Lebensraum, for new territories, for room, for space to grow, and a big navy and a scary military machine, Germany was trying to get back from Venezuela a bunch of debts that Venezuela had failed to honor. And the Kaiser was so peremptory in his demands for this money that he sent in gunboats into the Venezuelan waters to blockade Venezuela and force the corrupt dictator of that country, whose name amusingly was President Castro, to pay up. Now TR, who had a rather robust sense of responsibilities, thought that the Kaiser was perfectly entitled to get his money. It was money honorably lent and which should be conscientiously repaid. He also had a pretty low opinion of President Castro, whom he called an unspeakably villainous little monkey, a pithy canthropoid, in another speech, and was quite willing to have Germany coerce this little Latin American republic, providing there was no military maneuver which led to Germany setting foot on the South American continent. And when he heard, after the German ships had arrived, that the Kaiser had ordered them to impound Venezuelan custom houses, TR called in the German ambassador, Herr Theodore von Holleben, a diplomat of the Alter School, an old Prussian German, saying to him, I quite understand why your emperor has done what he has done, but you must understand that under the precepts of the Monroe Doctrine, we, the United States, cannot tolerate any military presence in our hemisphere which would lead to the possible re-establishment in the Americas of an old world force. Therefore, I must ask you to put this matter to arbitration, and you can tell His Majesty from me in strict secrecy, and I will tell nobody, not even my own immediate family, that if he does not withdraw his ships within 10 days from this date, I happen to have most of the military mass of the United States Navy in those same waters right now, exercising under the famous anti-Teuton Admiral Dewey, and if you do not withdraw your ships, we will go to war with you. This ultimatum, delivered in TR's characteristic fashion, which was through smiling, snapping teeth, and physical massage of the shoulder, so shocked Ambassador von Holleben that he literally did not believe it. And he failed to transmit to Kaiser Wilhelm the essence of this ultimatum. He was too scared to. And when the situation continued to worsen, Roosevelt called the German ambassador back in and said, "What message do you have for me in return from the ultimatum I delivered to you the other day?" Von Holleben said, "But there was no ultimatum." And Roosevelt said, "I want you to understand two things. One is that my ultimatum is now repeated. And the second thing is, it's going to be 2 days less than 10. It's now going to be an 8-day ultimatum." And Holleben, realizing that he had precipitated the beginnings of a severe international crisis, rushed back to the German embassy, took an overnight train to New York City under cloak of snow, and transmitted certain messages to Berlin, which made the urgency of the situation clear to the Wilhelmstrasse, and lo and behold, the Kaiser withdrew his ships. What is remarkable about this crisis, which by the way ended in Herr von Holleben being summarily withdrawn in disgrace by the German emperor, a complete purge of the German embassy. What's remarkable about this crisis is that Theodore Roosevelt was quite prepared, as the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, to threaten war and to manage to keep the crisis so secret and to expunge the diplomatic record afterward so efficiently that a vacuum has appeared in the historical record. Blank after blank after blank, dozens, scores, hundreds of sheets of the diplomatic records in the United States, in the German Foreign Office, in the British Foreign Office, and even in the French Foreign Office, are a blank between about December the 10th, 1902, and February the 15th, 1903. The reason this blank was brought about, as far as we can discover, is that TR was aware that if the Kaiser had been seen to have been publicly humiliated by submitting to an ultimatum of this kind, he would have become even more dangerous than he was already, and World War I would very likely have broken out a lot sooner than it did. When he negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Jules Jusserand, the French ambassador, said, "President Roosevelt, throughout this long and tortuous mediation, has conducted himself with a tact, a diplomacy, and a regard for the sensibilities of other countries that only a true gentleman can command." The relationships of TR and Jusserand is something I explore in great detail in the book because it was a meeting of minds. This French ambassador, a small, natty, bearded man, happened to be a superb athlete, was TR's inseparable tennis partner. There was in those days a tennis court immediately adjoining the West Wing, which Edith Roosevelt gave her husband as a surprise present. So he could, at any time of the day when it suited him, step out of the windows of his office and start playing tennis. He and Jusserand struck up such an intellectual and physical friendship that it's one of the more charming stories in the history of the Roosevelt presidency. And to give you an example of the flavor of their relationship and also something of the eccentricity of the president, I'll tell you about a walk they had, walk in quotation marks, in May of 1908. A walk to Theodore Roosevelt was to go out on a midwinter afternoon, or in this case, a rainy spring afternoon, dive stark naked into the Potomac, ordering whoever was with him to join in the fun. And then on the other side, having tried to climb back into their soaked clothing, to start climbing a rock face. On this particular day, Jusserand told the story. He said that the president stripped and was just wading into the water up to his hips in the Potomac, stark naked, turned round and saw Ambassador Jusserand standing in the mud, also naked, except for a pair of black kid gloves. And TR called out, "Hey, Mr. Ambassador, why are you wearing those kid gloves?" And the ambassador said, "Because, Mr. President, we might meet ladies." The story of the Panama Revolution is, I guess, pretty familiar to most of you. But again, to communicate to you the richness of this man's mind, I'd like you to know that at the precise moment that all hell was breaking loose in Panama, on November the 3rd, 1903, the President of the United States was on his way back from Oyster Bay, where he'd gone to vote, in a train, writing out with the stub of a pencil, at the request of the President of Columbia University, a list from memory of all the books he'd read since he became president 1.5 years before. And I can assure you this is going to be a very short extract from it. Jiggling in the train, with his pencil, he wrote, "Parts of Herodotus, the 1st and 7th books of Thucydides, all of Polybius, a little of Plutarch, Aeschylus's Orestian trilogy, Sophocles' 7 Against Thebes, Euripides' Hippolytus and Bacchae, Aristophanes' Frogs, parts of the Politics of Aristotle." All these, I say here, had been in translation. However, he had also read, in French, the biographies of Prince Eugene of Savoy, Admiral Michel de Ruyter, Henri Turenne, and John Sobieski. He'd also browsed, if not deeply studied, Froissart on French history, Maspero on the early Syrian, Chaldean, and Egyptian civilizations, and, quote, some 6 volumes of Mahaffy's study of the Greek world. What else? The memoirs of Marbot, Bain's Life of Charles XII, Mahan's Types of Naval Officers, some of Macaulay's essays. I'm directly quoting now from TR. 3 or 4 volumes of Gibbon and 3 or 4 chapters of Motley. The battles in Carlyle's Frederick the Great. Hay and Nicolay's 10-volume Lincoln, and the 2 volumes of Lincoln's speeches and writings. These I've not only read through, but have read parts of them over and over again. Bacon's essays, Macbeth, Twelfth Night, Henry IV, Henry V, Richard II, the first 2 cantos of Milton's Paradise Lost, some of Michael Drayton's poems, there are only 3 or 4 that I care for, and portions of the Nibelungen Lied. This letter goes on for another 2 pages. He left the White House in 1909, just 50 years old. After almost 2 full terms, 7.5 years, he was 5 years younger than President Bush is today. In 1908, at the time of the Republican National Convention, he could without question have taken and won the Republican nomination, and without question would have been re-elected to a 3rd term as president. I think, apart from his conservation legacy, that his single greatest act, indicating the fineness of his character, was that at that moment in 1908, in the full possession of all his powers, his youth, his strength, the total command he'd won over Congress, his love of power and his enjoyment of the White House. He once said, I think Edith and I have been the happiest people who ever lived in this house. With all these things offered to him on a silver plate, he chose not to accept a 3rd term for the honorable reason that George Washington had set a precedent that 2 terms of supreme power were enough, that power inevitably would corrupt even somebody like he, whom power befitted so well, and that in honor of that tradition he would give it up. The deep irony of his life is, of course, that after he'd given it up, after he happily went back to private life, he began to hanker for it again. And like all strong men, began to be bitterly critical of how his successor had handled, President Taft was handling things, and came back in 1912 to campaign for the White House again. Walked into an assassin's bullet in September of 1912, barely survived, in an assassination attempt, by the way, which is uncannily similar to that perpetrated on Ronald Reagan in 1981. Although he did not succeed in winning that fight to be re-elected, his life went into a pretty slow, almost Aristotelian decline. It's like that bullet hit him at the exact point in his life, the height of his powers, and from then onward, his psychological and emotional life began to deteriorate. During World War II, he became something of a curmudgeon. He became obsessed with Woodrow Wilson as being Mr. Original Peacenik. He excoriated him in a magnificent phrase as that Byzantine logothete in the White House, and developed a sick lust to go back to war himself, to raise another regiment of Rough Riders. And when he was deprived of that right by President Wilson, sent his 4 sons into battle with a rather creepy hope that one of them, or more of them, would be wounded and show the valor that was in them. In the summer of 1919, his youngest son, Quentin, 1918, sorry, I have my prompter here. His youngest son, Quentin, the one most like him, almost a reincarnation of TR, was killed in a dogfight over France. And that was the final blow that brought TR down. When he died, a few months later, at the age of 60, in January of 1919, he would, if he'd survived, again without question, have been renominated for the presidency by the Republican Party. And given the political temper of the time, he almost certainly would have been re-elected in the year 1920. So it's one of the great what-ifs of history, and the story of his last 10 years, which I'll be telling in Volume 3, is one that is deeply human and poignant in contrast to the splendor and the successes I describe in Theodore Rex. In conclusion, I'll just explain to you, to those of you who are not aware of this, that the phrase Theodore Rex was Henry James's. Henry James, who in earlier years had been the butt of some of TR's matchless invective. Back in the 1890s, TR despised expatriate American intellectuals who went overseas and lived the lives of other countries when they should have been here improving our own civilization. Wrote an essay calling Henry James that little emasculated bunch of inanities. Henry James was perfectly well capable of deploying the English language in his own self-defense, responded by calling TR the mere monstrous embodiment of unprecedented and resounding noise. However, when they finally met face-to-face in January of 1905, James was so struck by the pageantry of the White House, by the formality and perfect manners that obtained there, and also by the regal quality of TR's command of both the popularity he enjoyed with the American people and his total command over Congress, that James wrote afterwards to a friend, "I was in the White House last night, state dinner, and Theodore Rex is distinctly trying to make a court." And I saw that phrase, I said, yes, that's the title. I have recently thought of the title of Volume 3, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be happy to take questions.
Again, for those who have questions, if you will go and line up at the mic over here. Thank you.
I have 2 quickie questions. When you think of the Roosevelts, you think of Eleanor and Franklin being masters of the press. And I remember in your first book, and I was impressed by the fact that he and Jacob Riis, when he was police commissioner, would go all around town, and that's where he learned to use the press. Do you think that his siblings, his niece and her husband, picked that up from him and learned to really, you know, to get control of the country, command the press like that?
Thanks for the Stolichnaya. It's excellent. Well, Franklin, who was TR's 5th cousin, always admitted throughout his life that the greatest man he ever met or knew was Cousin Teddy. And he set out to model himself on the president He went to the New York State Legislature. He studied at Harvard, of course. Was humiliated at not being made a member of the Porcellian Club, as cousin Theodore had. Talked about it the rest of his life that he never made the pork. But he then went on after the New York State Legislature to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just like his cousin, and finally Governor of New York State. We all know what qualities FDR began to discharge once he became president. He had the same gift of overwhelming charm that cousin Theodore had had. He never had the intellectual equipment of Theodore, but he was perhaps a rather more ruthless and practiced politician. And his greatness is without question. With regard to the manipulation of the press, I would put both men on the same plane. Without question, FDR must have learned from cousin Teddy, because when I said earlier on that TR's first priority as the new young president was to address terrorism, I should have said that was priority number 2. Priority number 1 was to seduce the Washington press corps. Practically on his first day in office, he called together the heads of the 3 news syndicates. I think I've got it here in chapter 1. And laid down the law to them, saying, "This being my first day in the White House as President of the United States," Roosevelt said ingratiatingly, "I desire to have a little talk with you gentlemen who are responsible for the collection and dissemination of the news. A certain code of relations," he went on, "should be established immediately." He glanced at the Associated Press and Sun service representatives. "Mr. Boynton and Mr. Barry, whom I've known for many years and who have always possessed my confidence, shall continue to have it. But they must understand that this privilege depended on their, quote, discretion as to publication. Unfortunately, he could not promise equal access to Mr. Keene of the United Press, whom I have just met for the first time." So he made it clear right away that he was going to involve the press in his confidences. He understood that the confidences of the president are catnip to reporters, and that if he discussed policy with them, the only payback he demanded was they should not print anything he didn't want them to print. So within 24 hours, he had the newsmen in his grasp, and for the rest of his presidency, he was the first president ever to give the press corps a room in the White House. He played the Washington press like a cello, and we all know how FDR did the same, and it's no doubt under the influence of cousin Ted. Thank you.
I've read that TR had a lifelong feeling of guilt because his father had bought his way out of the Civil War service, that TR carried this kind of a burden psychologically through his life. That was I'm posing that for your comment, but the second thing was, I'd read that when Quentin was killed, that TR was very excited about that and felt that there had been a vindication of the family honor before he had this reaction of distraughtness. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that. Finally, I think that the naked swim was in Rock Creek, not in the Potomac.
Thank you. I stand corrected, sir, and I hope I didn't put Potomac in the book. By the way, there were many nude swims, but I do not doubt that they were all in Rock Creek. The first, the question of his father buying a substitute soldier can only be dealt with speculatively. I did discuss it in The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, new out in a revised edition from the Modern Library. It's quite likely, given TR's character, that he would have felt that kind of guilt. We must be sympathetic toward his father for the understandable fact that he was married to an unregenerate Confederate wife. Mittie Roosevelt was as passionately a Southerner as Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was a passionate Republican Northerner. So it was an impossible position that the elder Roosevelt was in when war did break out. He did go to war in the sense that he became an allotment commissioner, and he worked a lot with President Lincoln to do what he could in the war effort, but he did not fight And knowing TR's proclivities, that was an item of some embarrassment. Whether he was thinking of his father when he was trying to get a Medal of Honor for himself, I do not know. I do think it's one of the few misjudgments he made in his life that he campaigned for that medal after the Spanish-American War with such a sense of personal rightness that he should get it. He said, that medal is mine, I deserve it, I must have it. That it went beyond gentlemanly decorum, and I feel very uneasy about him getting it now for sentimental reasons 100 years later. And thank you for correcting me about the naked swims.
But in terms of Quentin's death, did you have any feeling that TR was excited about it?
Oh, sorry, Quentin's death. I missed
yes,
that part.
Right.
He was excited over the fact that his other sons had been wounded in battle, and he talked about their wounds as though they were medals. But Quentin's death was the ultimate reality. It was almost as though a large part of himself had died. And although he's supposed to have died of pulmonary embolism, that's what it says in the medical certificate, I think it was plain old broken heart.
Daddy, my question about Kaiser having known sons at the front and how the German army was demoralized by that when he, Theodore Roosevelt, had all four boys there.
My official prompter and historian reminds me that the Kaiser had, how many, 4 sons at the front? At least had 4 sons who were not at the front, or none of his sons. Whereas, and according to romantic rumor, I'm not too sure if I believe this, the German troops were somewhat demoralized by the fact that Theodore Roosevelt sent his sons to battle, but Kaiser Bill did not. Yes, sir.
First question is, why, in view of your enthusiasm, why do you think that Teddy Roosevelt has always been named a near great president in any survey of historians and has never been listed among the great historians? I'm sorry, presidents, the near great presidents by historians, and never listed as a great historian, great president. And secondly, since you did all of your education overseas and cultural background comes from overseas, how did you latch on to Theodore Roosevelt?
All right, well, let me correct you on the first. Theodore Roosevelt was rated as our 3rd greatest president by American historians immediately after he died, after Washington and Lincoln. But his stock slipped precipitously in the 1930s after the publication of a very iconoclastic biography of him by Henry Pringle. It was also a decade, as one remembers, of the rise of military fascism in Europe, and the sort of resolute military values that TR espoused in his life became so unfashionable that his presidential stock dropped right down. And it only began to rise again after World War II, slowly but steadily. But in the 1970s and 1980s, it shot up to such a point that the most recent presidential poll of the nation's historians rated him as number 4 after Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And in popular poll conducted by C-SPAN last year, he came out at number 3. So he's now, by general consent, considered one of our great presidents. And I hope that by writing this substantial history of his presidency, which is the first book-length treatment of his presidency, unbelievably, apart from an academic volume by Lewis Gould, I hope that his stature as a man of peace and as a diplomat will be more appreciated than it has been up till now.
And your interest?
And the interest in Theodore Roosevelt was somewhat connected with my African boyhood, because when Nairobi, Kenya, that great metropolis, celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1950, when I was 10, they published a centennial history of the city, and on page 10 or 11 there was this blurry photograph of the famous former American president, Theodore Roosevelt, who came to Kenya in 1910 and proceeded to obliterate most of the large game mammals in the East African Protectorate. And there was something about his face, the pith helmet, the teeth and the spectacles, that appealed to a small boy, and I thought, he looks as though he'd be fun to spend time with. Forgot about him for, I don't know, a quarter of a century until Nixon resigned in 1975. And during that extraordinary speech to the White House staff, when he began to sob and talk about his mother, he read a very moving little eulogy that T.R. had written after the death of his first wife, Alice Lee. And I was so moved by these words and so perplexed why Nixon should identify them with leaving the White House that I went and looked up the circumstances, and they struck me as so poignant that I could see the germ of a screenplay here. And that interest developed into a screenplay, and the screenplay mutated into Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 8. So it all grew out of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Two parts. First, in 1912, was not the Republican nomination stolen out from under him when a couple of delegations were taken? And then the great what if, assuming he had been elected in 1912, what would the impact, in your opinion, obviously, have been in the First World War?
Well, so one can luxuriate in speculation. If indeed he had been elected, we do know from the way he reacted to the sinking of the Lusitania and the way he reacted to the phenomenon of German Americanism, which became noticeable in the American political scene immediately the war broke out. German Americans across the country began to exhibit ambivalent attitudes to the war in Europe, and indeed began to speak of themselves, I think for the first time in our history, as German-Americans, leading TR to deliver a marvelous excoriation against hyphenated Americanism, as he called it. And in a matchless piece of political rhetoric, he said, I myself, Theodore Roosevelt, represent many different ethnic strains in my ancestry. But my motherland, my fatherland, and my native land are all three of them the United States. So that kind of visceral reaction against what was happening in Europe, plus his own natural desire to wage moral war, plus the fact that he might have been president in 1914, certainly makes it easy to speculate that we would have gotten into the war at least 2 years earlier than we did. But the what-ifs of history are best left to novelists, I think.
He was friends with the Kaiser by that time. He could have talked him out of it.
If you like, I'll give you the microphone. Just because you wrote a biography of Edith Kermit Roosevelt, you think you know everything. And unfortunately, she does. I was once lecturing about him, and somebody said to me, poleaxed me by standing up saying, Mr. Morris, what did he die of? I didn't know. I stood there gulping like a fish, and Sylvia was in the back, shouted out, pulmonary embolism. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you a further question about your title. I wondered whether either you or Henry James was trying to conjure up, at least in part, the image of Tyrannosaurus Rex, who also had rather prominent teeth.
That's a neat point, and I wish I'd thought of that.
Well, I do have a serious question, though, too. It seems to me that Roosevelt is the only American who could be compared with Winston Churchill, and I wondered what you thought of that comparison, although obviously his career was much shorter.
Yes, I've often thought of that parallel. They both personified their countries in times of great crisis. They both were literary people who wrote many books. They both were extraordinarily funny men, constantly cracking up all those who knew them with their humor and their wit. They both had the gift of epigram. And they both represented the upper crust of society, but at the same time had the gift of identifying with the common people. So the parallels are certainly many, and the interesting footnote to this is that they did once meet when T.R. was governor of New York State, and Winston Churchill had been a correspondent in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, came to visit the governor and spend a night with him in Albany. And T.R. detested him on sight. And when asked about it afterwards, he gave the rather characteristic reply, he was discourteous to women. He did not stand up when women came into the room. He is not a gentleman. Yes, sir.
I was lucky enough to hear you on Diane Reham's show this morning on the radio, and you mentioned that you had given a talk to the White House staff. I
Yes.
wonder if you can tell us what you talked about and what they picked up on.
Well, I talked more or less along the lines I had been speaking earlier this evening about the parallels between that time and this, and the way that crisis seems to precipitate presidents who personify the best in us, that times of trial make presidential men who seemed to the American people before they took office to have been less substantial than they indeed became. And I talked a lot about TR's intellectual equipment and found the senior staff there intensely curious about his presidential qualities for the very good reason that all administrations like to feel that the ground that they are now treading had been trodden before with safety by their predecessors. And it was something of a homecoming for me because that library where I spoke was where I used to hang out between interviews in the Reagan years.
You also mentioned you'd met the president and may have been too brief, but can you comment on the role of intellect in the presidency in a time of crisis? I mean, I don't think it's everything, and so I don't know what you're going to say.
Well, I was there for like 6 minutes with Sylvia, and that seems like an eternity when you're talking to the President of the United States, but I found him a much bigger man than I expected. He's a big, strapping six-footer, giving off a glow of health which seems to come with, a lot of it is the gloss of power, of course, but he's a splendid machine, President Bush, and a really likable man. He has the same charm that his father had. They are really terrific people. What struck me less than his culture, because we really didn't get into intellectual subjects at all, was his piety. He's obviously a deeply religious man. When my wife complimented him on the rapport he seems to have developed, the chemistry with President Putin, he said, well, you know, he's a great guy, and one of the first things he did when we met was show me this cross, this crucifix. And he said, I realized when I saw this cross that he and I had a lot in common, this iconic emblem. And he went on for 2 or 3 minutes on this vein in a way that made me realize he's genuinely pious and seems to need to talk about it too. And I guess when you consider what he's been going through the last few months, he needs all the crosses he can handle.
One more question. I hate to end this, but I think
Okay. One more, please.
Teddy Roosevelt was known as a trust buster. What was his relationship with men like J.P. Morgan and people on Wall Street?
Well, he called them at various times malefactors of great wealth, the wealthy criminal class. One of the more charming aspects of his character, at least to me, is the fact that although he was born to wealth and privilege, he always found money boring. He did not particularly like money men because he said that whenever he spent time with corporate people, he found that all they wanted to talk about was money and that they seemed to have absolutely nothing else to them but money. He particularly, and for moral reasons, despised inherited wealth and unearned wealth because his rather quaint 19th century notion was that money and great fortune should be repaid in the form of public service. He was aware that as a young man he had both money and great cultural endowments. He had Harvard, a splendid education and privilege, and he all his life tried to pay it back in the form of hard public service. So his relationship with men like J.P. Morgan was not warm. They tended to admire each other as men, but they were from different planets. And it was not surprising that as TR waxed in power in the year 1906 and 7, that Wall Street began to disseminate perfectly sincere rumors that the president was insane, was a drug addict, and an alcoholic. And when told this by a friend, Theodore Roosevelt was convulsed with laughter. Thank you, everybody.
Well, we've just had a taste tonight of what a great biography is. Thank you again for coming. Edmund Morris will sign. Books are for sale at the register. Again, if people in the front rows will help us fold up the chairs, and if you could line up to my right. Thank you for coming. Let me put it. That was a very, very good talk.
Thank you so much.
Oopsie, I'm gonna push
Edmund Morris was President Reagan's official biographer and author of Dutch, a memoir of Ronald Reagan. His latest, Theodore Rex, is the sequel to his 1979 Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. It's published by Random House. If you'd like to find out more or read an excerpt, visit their website at randomhouse.com. "48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Coming up, Maury Klein talks about his latest book, Rainbow's End, The Crash of 1929, which details events leading up to the stock market crash of 1929 and examines its relationship to the Great Depression. And then travel along Hillary Rodham Clinton's Senate campaign with Associated Press staff writer Beth Harpaz as she discusses her new book, The Girls in the Van. Later today on Book TV, author Adrian Haville on The Spy Who Stayed Out in the Cold, his book about former FBI agent Robert Hansen. After that, an examination of the influences that led President Roosevelt to authorize the internment of over 110,000 Japanese